I want to thank everyone for coming. This is our last event here at Cambridge for our Black History Month programming. And today we have Rep. Byron Rushing. If you're not familiar with him, in 1982, Rushing was elected as a representative of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. And he was the chief sponsor of the law to end discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in public schools and an original sponsor of the gay rights bill in Massachusetts. Rushing also led the Massachusetts State Pension Fund to launch community development investment of poor communities of Massachusetts. Rushing is an elected deputy to the General Convention of the Episcopal Church, a founding member of the Episcopal Urban Caucus, and serves on the board of the Episcopal Women's Caucus and the Episcopal Network for Economic Justice. In addition to being a local politician, he is also a phenomenal historian, and he's going to give a little bit of context on slavery as it pertains to Massachusetts. And I find this to be particularly interesting because I know that it's common to context slavery as a Southern phenomenon, and people don't really talk about the occurrence of it in the North, particularly in the New England area. So I'm sure this will be a great little talk. So here he is.
Thank you very much. It's really good to be with you this afternoon. And I understand I got squeezed in. This is February 28th. But I do want to say, you probably have heard this already, but I want to just reiterate it because we have a lot of discussion around both inside the white community as well as the Black community about Black History Month. And so I want to just say a word about the origin of Black History Month. Black History Month derives from what was clearly an attempt to strengthen the teaching of Black history, not in white schools, but in Black schools. Black History Month's origin goes back to the segregated South. It actually originated a few years after World War I, when a group of Black teachers went to a group of Black historians, scholars, academics, and asked them for help in what they should teach about Black history in their schools. That the favorite word, title for Black people, of course, in those days was Negro, and what was invented was Negro History Week. And Negro History Week was to be a time when the teachers who had been teaching Black history and Black cultural studies all year round would have a time when their students could show off, when their students could come and talk about what they learned and write poems and read short stories and read short papers that they had written, whether they were in elementary school, junior high school, or high school. And one of the things, of course, that those teachers, most of whom, of course, were African American, one of those things that teachers knew in that segregated system was they could teach anything as long as they didn't teach about ending segregation. Then they'd get fired. But otherwise, white people didn't care what they taught Black kids. And so they used that opening, that opportunity, to talk about Black culture to Black kids. And they felt not unprepared to do that. And the person who came up with this whole idea and advancing this curriculum was a historian at Howard University named Carter G. Woodson. And he came up with the idea of doing Negro History Week, and he came up with the idea of creating a magazine called the Negro History Bulletin, which was designed for teachers to help them build their curricula. He chose this week in February, this Negro History Week in February. I suspect that if most of the Black historians who took part in this whole program to advance the teaching of Black history in segregated schools, most of which were in the South, if they had been all Northerners, we probably wouldn't have picked February. But they picked February. And they picked February because in February, two dates that they considered good dates to celebrate occurred. One was February 12th, and the other one was February 14th. Now, I don't know if, is anybody here? No, you're too young to know, to remember probably, that we had two holidays in February. One for Lincoln, that was February 12th, and the other one was for George Washington on February 22nd. And then they got merged into President's Day, which is truly the second silliest holiday on our calendar. The first is Columbus Day, and then following Columbus Day comes President's Day. All of you could make a list of presidents you don't think we should ever mention again. Let's celebrate. Then, but the other date that was chosen, that was important and seemed and was close to the 12th was the 14th. And February 14th, anybody? February 4th? No, don't say Valentine's. February 14th? February 14th was the birthday of Frederick Douglass. And of course, Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass were contemporaries, but lived very, very different lives, though they did have an interesting group of similarities. But Frederick Douglass, of course, had run away from slavery when he was enslaved in Maryland. And like a number of slaves, he had no idea what day he was born. And so when he was free, he realized that people had birthdays, and he wanted a birthday, and he chose the day. Just like many African Americans who escaped from slavery, they chose a day for whatever reason that they would now consider their birthday. And they didn't know their birthday because, and this gets into what I'll be speaking about for the next few minutes, because as enslaved people, there were records kept about them. But the records that were kept about enslaved people were generally not in any official registry at a county, city, or county or city hall. They were not even in most birth registries in churches. Where their records were not with other human beings. Their records were with animals. They were treated by most plantation owners as animals. And so if you go to today, Thomas Jefferson's farm books, all of his records of all of the farming that was done at Monticello, if you go there now, they are preserved. His records of how many sheep were born, how many cows were born, how many pigs were purchased, and in those records, you will find also how many slaves were born and the records of their purchase or sale, their death, all in those records because, of course, they were property. And I want to start there with this discussion about the ending of slavery by talking about, first, what was ended, what was abolished. We don't talk a lot about slavery in this country. We talk about slavery usually in discussions of its ending. There's not a lot of discussion about its beginnings. There's not a lot of discussion about its middle. Slavery and the slave trade in the Americas existed longer than emancipation and civil rights for the descendants of slaves has yet existed. If you use one of the shortest periods of slavery, which slavery where most of the slave masters were British, if you're talking about slavery in North America, slavery started about 1619. And it's the approximate date of the introduction of slavery into the colony of Virginia. The slavery then, if you use as its ending in what became the United States, slavery existed until 1865. Many of us always, when we think about the end of slavery, think about the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation, of course, was a war proclamation, and it did not free all the slaves. It only freed certain of the slaves, and that was done in 1863. But the slavery ended in the United States for the whole country legally by amending the Constitution, and that was the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. And so if you quickly do those numbers, that arithmetic between 1619 and 1865, you get to 246. 246 years of slavery. Add 246 to 1865, and you get what? What year? 2111. So it will not be until 2111 that people of African descent will have been free in the United States as long as they had been enslaved. This is a defining cultural aspect, political, economic, and cultural aspect of American history. It cannot discuss American history accurately without spending that proportion of time and energy and words and pictures on slavery as we do on the years after slavery. This is important because slavery has become, in many ways, mythic. And if we are going to move from the myth of slavery as an incidental occurrence that just happened, there are a few people who decided they wanted to own people, but generally it is not what moved this country to become this country. If we are going to move from the myth of slavery as an incidental occurrence in the early days of the European occupation of the Americas to the truth, accuracy of slavery as part of the truth of the origins of the nations of the Americas, and specifically of the origins and economic success of the United States, it will require the production of a new history. It'll require the production of a more accurate history. It'll require the production of a new paradigm about the invention of America, the invention of the United States. The stories, and I'm using paradigm here in the sense of the stories which we combine into a set of experiences, beliefs, and values that affect the way we perceive ourselves, perceive our origin. So let me start with an origin story about slavery in Massachusetts. So listen carefully, because I want to get these words right. So I'm going to quote the first colonial governor, the leader of the Puritans who invaded Massachusetts in 1630. I start with the Puritans because, for a whole variety of reasons, I think we should all ignore the Pilgrims. I hope there's no one here from Plymouth, Massachusetts. The Pilgrims, of course, were a small group of Protestants, literally from one congregation, that decided to come to the Americas. And of course, as many of you know, they thought they were going to Northern Virginia. Most people think the captain knew where he was going, just didn't tell the people, the Pilgrims who were on the ship. And of course, the Mayflower gets to the coast, ends up in Provincetown. Those of you who go to Provincetown know there's a big tower in Provincetown, and that is commemorating the first landing of the Pilgrims. And before the captain takes off, they realize there's no fresh water. And they insist that he take them someplace where there's fresh water, and the place that he takes them is is the place that they name Plymouth. And if it wasn't for a number of reasons why Pilgrims became part of the mythology of the whole United States, which mostly happened after the Civil War, none of us would know about them. Or maybe just the people who live in Plymouth. one ship, they didn't fill up the ship, the Mayflower. A few years later, the Puritans invade. The Puritans are a party, both a church and political party in England, and they are attempting to overthrow both the government and reform the church. This group that comes to the Americas land in several places, and the most northern place that they land is what is going to become the colony of Massachusetts Bay. When they are here, about 6.5 or 7 years, they come to a serious conflict with the indigenous people who are here. The English always knew there were going to be indigenous people when they got here. The English, when they came, assumed that they could take the land that was here. It never dawned on them that they should send ambassadors over to negotiate with the people who are here. Right? We can't imagine that. We smile every time I say that to audiences. Everyone, not everyone, but many people just smile. The idea is just completely out of our paradigm thing. The idea that we would have asked to be invited. And so the Puritans come, and within 6.5 years, they are engaged in serious violent conflict with some of the Indian nations that are in Massachusetts and south of Massachusetts. And they have a major conflict which historians have come to call the Pequod War. John Winthrop, in his journal, writes this: "We had now slain and taken in all about 700. We sent 15 of the boys and 2 women to Bermuda by Mr. Pierce, but he, missing it, carried them to Providence Isle." What had happened is that the decision after this conflict is over, the English have won. The next decision that has to be made is what to do with all of the Native Americans that they have captured, the POWs. And they decide to sell them into slavery. They understand that it's going to be too difficult to sell them into slavery right in a land that they have lived in for generations, and the Puritans have only known for less than a decade. And so they decide to sell them into slavery away. Bermuda is one place that they think about sending them. They had already sent other Indians that they had captured to Bermuda, but the captain, for whatever reason, decides to go to a Puritan colony that had been founded a few years before Massachusetts off the coast of Central America, which they called Providence Isle. He goes there. And then in February, interesting, 1638, we have this notation in Winthrop's diary. Mr. Pierce, in the Salem ship, the Desire, returned from the West Indies after 7 months. He had been at Providence and brought some cotton and tobacco and Negroes from thence. This is the first written record that we have of Africans arriving in Massachusetts. There is so much to say about these 2 notations. I will only note that in this whole story, I can tell you the name of the ship, I can tell you the name of the captain of the ship, Mr. Pierce, I can tell you where they went, I can tell you the dates. The one thing I cannot tell you are the number, the actual number, and the names of the Africans that were brought back. When Pierce gets to Providence Isle, he might have seen Africans for the first time in his whole life. The Puritans on Providence Isle had already begun to engage in the African slave trade. He sells the Indians and buys Africans and brings them back to Massachusetts. We assume all entered into slavery, and these first slaves in Massachusetts were owned by the colony. The founders of what the United States is today are all in this story. This is an example of an alternative founding story. It is a founding story that you could probably find other examples in almost every colony, be them French, Spanish, Portuguese, or, as these in North America, British. The founders of whom we are today as a nation, the Aboriginal, the native people, the English, the Europeans, and the Africans. What in our language, in our almost slang, came to be known as the red, the white, and the black. And they all, if we are to have an accurate history, they all must be in this new paradigm if it is to approach the truth. Now, this new paradigm is not going to undo big chunks of the sacred scripture of the old paradigm. So we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, can stay. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That all can stay. Those were quite remarkable statements. No one denies that. There's a great book on the history of 18th century slavery called Bury the Chains, in which the author says that at the end of the 18th century, well over 3/4 of all people alive in the world were in bondage or were masters of people who were in bondage. So the basic idea of freedom being innate to people was an incredible, radical idea. But as Frederick Douglass would say a few years later, when he was asked to comment on the celebration of the 4th of July in the United States, in a speech in 1852, pride and patriotism, not less than gratitude, prompt you to celebrate and to hold it in perpetual remembrance. I have said that the Declaration of Independence is the ring bolt to the chain of your nation's destiny, so indeed I regard it. The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Stand by those principles, be true to them on all occasions, in all places, against all foes, at whatever cost. And all of the minority groups that have felt themselves oppressed in the United States have always turned back on the majority group, their scripture, their Declaration of Independence, their United States Constitution. But if we do not include the other people as people, not as property, not as inferior, but people who are innately free, then we look at the founders in a very different way. Native Americans, they were here. They were here. And, of course, as you know, here for thousands and thousands of years. But Europeans had developed a politics and a theology that allowed them to believe that in their superiority, they could go anywhere in the world that was not Christian and claim it for themselves. If you had asked these people why did they think they could do this, if you had asked Winthrop why he thought he could do this, if you had asked the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese who preceded him, why do you think they could do this, they would not say because they're white. They wouldn't say because they were European. They hadn't gotten that concept yet. Right? They would have said because we are Christian. And so when Europeans got into a conflict over who could take which land from what they described as infidels, they didn't go to their king to ask him to resolve this. They had no law that they could go to have it resolved. Where did they go? They went to the Pope. They went to the Pope because the Pope was head of Western Christianity. And that was who would make the decision about dividing the world in half between the Portuguese and the Spaniards. Native Americans. Native Americans have their land stolen. Sometimes that land was stolen with warfare, sometimes that war was stolen by deceit, but essentially it was stolen. And when you steal land, you want to make sure that the owner of the land that was stolen has no place in the legal or political system where they can protest, even at a later date. Right? And so the only good Indian is a... How many people know the end of that? Raise your hand. Where did you learn it? It wasn't in your textbooks. Where did you learn it? Right? It's part of the paradigm, you see. Part of the paradigm, part of the culture. And having stolen the land, and of course, by the time the British were there, it was a regular thing. There was nothing they had to think up. Right? Having stolen the land, a remarkable thing occurs, and that in order to exploit all of this land, these people from these tiny little countries, principalities, kingdoms in Europe, struck by the amazing amount of what was there, cannot figure out a way to exploit it to its fullest with only Christian labor, with only white labor. And so they steal people. They steal labor. They steal Africans. And that, of course, is the origin of the slave trade in the Americas. So we don't have a lot in this room, but probably watching we have more people of African descent. I can tell you one thing about your ancestors. If your ancestors came to the Americas, you belong to the only group of people in the Americas whose ancestors came here fully employed. Right? Slavery, about labor for free. Now, how do you break out of this? You break out of this by, first, I think, probably even before you do the theology, probably by the logic. I think people who first started to argue, white people who started to argue against slavery, argued because of the logic. If you bought into the idea that all people were free and then immediately caught yourself and realized you weren't talking about all people, at what point does logic just hit you over the head and say, how can I not include so-and-so, that group, those people, that sex, that women, how can I not include them in the all? Unfortunately, it was not the majority view. But almost from the beginning, there was protest to the idea of enslaving people, and there was protest to the idea of not including everybody in the all. For the slaves in Massachusetts, they, of course, had no question about the answer. They had no question about the answer, but they had no power to work it through. And so they, from the very beginning, began making alliances with those Europeans, those Americans, those white Americans who felt that way, even though they were in a minority. In Massachusetts, that logical position, fortunately, got to the level of our state Supreme Court. And so 3 years after the state of Massachusetts adopted its state constitution, which incorporated many of the words of the Declaration of Independence, had what it called itself a Declaration of Rights. That constitution was being interpreted by a brand newly created Supreme Judicial Court. And several of the cases around ownership of slaves came to that court, and eventually the court decided that one judge could decide them, their Chief Justice, Justice Cushing, and he writes an opinion that under the state constitution, obviously not the United States Constitution, but under the Massachusetts Constitution, no one could be enslaved. It happened early in the 1780s. By 1790, when the first United States Census was taken, the only state in Massachusetts of the 13 that recorded no slaves in the census was Massachusetts. Only Massachusetts in 1790 enumerated no slaves. And of course, one of the reasons for the census, right, was to determine representation in Congress, and the southern states in forming the Constitution had insisted that they be able to count the slaves toward the formula for that representation. And the compromise was that they could come up with a fiction that for every slave they had, who they did not believe was human, who could not vote, would be recorded as 3/5 of a person. And so we had to know how many slaves there were. Right? And Massachusetts comes out of this in 1790 with its clear mark that slavery is ended here. I have no doubt that there were a few that were still enslaved, but when the census taker came by, they knew enough to say, "Oh no, Mabel's my servant," right? But they did not get recorded. I hope there's no one here from Vermont. Anyone from Vermont? There's all the Vermont people always tell me they were first, except that they weren't a state. They thought they would try to be a republic first. And when they were a republic, that is true. Vermont's constitution as a republic said that they would have no slaves. They didn't come into the Union until 1791 as the 14th state. This feeling of anti-slavery grows in Massachusetts, but it has one huge contradiction, a lot of little contradictions, one huge contradiction. And that contradiction are the people who dealt in the trade. And Massachusetts ports were just ideal for harboring and sending out slave ships. And so the many capitalists in Massachusetts insisted on, although they would have no slaves themselves in Massachusetts, in trading slaves. And the trade for slaves went on until legal slave trade for slaves went on until 1808. The Constitution, in the United States Constitution, slave trading was given a 20-year break. So right in the Constitution, it says that 20 years after the ratification of this document, then Congress could begin to pass laws ending the slave trade. That was done because of the huge number of slaves who ran away during the American Revolution. There is one historian who argues that it was the largest slave rebellion in United States American history was the American Revolution. Not only could they run away, and most of them got their freedom by running away, white people were fighting white people, what a better time to leave, right? But they also negotiated. And they negotiated with both the British and the Patriots to fight and to help them in their war effort, and as a reward, be given emancipation, be manumitted if they survived. And many of them did. Approximately half with the British and the other half with the Patriots. And the British kept their word for most of them, and most of them who were freed went to Canada, with a lot of Tory Americans who went there also after the American Revolution. Into the 1900s, emancipation grows. throughout the country, throughout the northern part of the country. And the issue becomes whether we can survive as a state, as a country that is divided between free states and non-free states. If we can survive as a country, and in that way, the first set of political struggle is over what to do with all the new states, what to do with all the Western lands that are becoming states, all the Western lands that have been stolen from the Indians. Should those lands be free or slave in this growing country? That is the argument that the Lincoln-Douglas debates was all about, expansion of slavery. And finally, it comes to a head in the Civil War. When the Civil War is over, the Africans believe that they will be free. And many of them are free. Most of them, for moments, are free. And as they struggle to get the experience, as they struggle to get the skills to live as free men and women, the major population in the South decide that they cannot tolerate it. And so we have a period, a kind of creative political hiatus, which we call Reconstruction, and then white people in the North and the South who have been killing each other at the end of that generation decide that they want to unite. They want to reunite. And as a condition of that reuniting, the Southern white people argue that they must have control of the Africans in their midst. It is a difficult history. It is a history that informs how we operate as residents, members, citizens of the United States to this moment. There probably are no major political arguments in this country that do not have strong, accurate analogies in the history of Africans in this geography and the history of Native Americans, except it is not approached, it is not directly taught, it is not directly thought about as we go forward. The problem of history, of course, is that it can be like memory. And like memory, if you lose it, you get disoriented. If you lose your memory, you actually do not know where you are. And this disorientation makes it difficult to make decisions about the future. Similarly, in history, if we have a history that is allowed to contain the gaps that our history is allowed to contain, that the decisions that we make as citizens, as a people, are decisions made from disorientation. They are decisions made from untruths. And so the task for Black history, of course, is not simply the study of Black history. The task of Black history is not to set aside a few days or a month to think about it. The task of Black history is to drive the argument that history has to be honest, and that when truth is the criteria for history, no one will have to have a month. Thank you.
I'm curious about how many slaves there were in Massachusetts when the Supreme Judicial Court gave that ruling.
Just under 5,000.
Okay. Out of how many, so what proportion?
Oh,
That's larger than I would have thought.
That would have been about 3%.
Okay.
Yeah.
As kind of a follow-up to that, I sort of had this idea in my head that one of the reasons why slavery was abolished so early in the North was because it wasn't as fundamental to the economy as it was in the South. Is this like an accurate idea, or do you think things would have been different if there were a lot more plantations in Massachusetts, or am I thinking about this wrong?
No, that's a very good question, and I think that we make that what slavery in large numbers means is that the whole society has to adjust to having slaves. And some historians have actually described they separate what they call slave societies, like the South before the Civil War, all of the West Indies, right? That there was just nothing that could happen that could be done without taking into consideration its effect on slavery or slavery's effect on it. But that you could still have the idea of owning people when it was just incidental. And so in Massachusetts, and I think most of the North, it was incidental. What is interesting about Massachusetts is that even though it was incidental certainly helps the argument about freeing, but then when you look at all the other northern states, right, at the time of the Civil War, slavery was still legal in half of the northern states. Right? So people found an economic advantage, right, in owning people, right? And there were enough people taking that economic advantage and owning people who did not find a political or economic contradiction in doing that. And even in Massachusetts, probably but it is true that the more economic advantage there is for slavery, the harder it is to build up the argument. And most slaves in Massachusetts were, that population by then worked in houses. They worked as servants in houses, or they worked in small businesses. They worked in taverns. And our only large agricultural use of slavery was in the Connecticut River Valley when we grew tobacco in Massachusetts. Yeah.
Do you think the textbooks that are used in Massachusetts schools accurately represent like true history? And if they don't, why do you think that is?
I think that I think the major reason why we don't have that accurate history is because I think most of us don't want to have it. See, I think most of us are, and it's not like an active thing that we do, but we think that the founding stories that we know make sense, that they answer all the questions. Right? And I think so you have to make a judgment call about, you can make a philosophical judgment call about accuracy, but you also have to make a judgment call of the connections, of seeing, of making sure you see the connections. Right? So I suspect that the average person in Massachusetts doesn't really care that they've never met an Indian from Massachusetts. They don't care. It's not like, oh, I've never met an Indian, I wonder why, right? So most of us know about Native Americans, the average person in Massachusetts, is we know all these places are named after it, right? Including the name of the state. We know that. We wouldn't say, if someone asked you, you would say, oh yeah, that's an Indian word. Right? So it is a kind of intentional judgment call that we need to make.
Hi. I'm wondering if you can compare or contrast the form that white supremacy took before the Civil War with the form that it took after Reconstruction and in the segregation era. and maybe even a connection to the Christian imperialism you were talking about earlier.
Right. I think the while there's slavery, certainly the people who support that economy and the people who support an economy of slavery are not only the slave masters. I mean, so a slave economy has a lot of people working for it, right? Free labor that is not immediately engaged in owning slaves, right? Because someone has to supply all the other stuff for the plantations. And so, but if in that group, right, so the argument comes up about the inferiority of black people, white people can quickly join in supporting that idea. It makes all the rest of it easier. So what happens when you end that slavery? And there are two things I think happen when you end that slavery. One is you try to make it as easy as possible, and that did not happen in ending slavery in the United States. It was not easy. All the slave masters lost their slave property, all of them. They got no compensation for that. Even when the British abolished slavery in the West Indies, although the slave masters complained that they didn't get enough money, they were given money. They were given some money for the slaves that were now free. Right? And so you try to figure out how you're going to make up that. Right? And so you shift the nature of that prejudice to keep black people in a position where you can still exploit them economically. And that, of course, happened not only in the South, but happened in the North, but it took its most egregious forms in the Southern states by creating racial segregation. And insisting, actually, on separation that you didn't even worry about with slaves. Right? So slaves were intimately, and I use that word intimately, involved with white people in a way that was illegal after the slavery ended. Right? So I think that once the decision is made that you are not going to treat people as free and equal, or as you would say, or not you would say, as one would say, one white person would say, you're not going to treat people as white, right? Then that prejudice shifts, but is there for the same reason, to maintain that society where oppression of another group is legal. Right? I don't know if there used to be a phrase that you don't hear much anymore. It came from a 1940s movie where a young woman is complaining about the way she's treated, and her retort is, "You can't do that to me. I'm free, white, and 21." Right? So two of those were directly related to race.
So first of all, thank you very much for coming. This has been a very interesting talk. One of the things I found sort of interesting that you mentioned was how there's a lot of parallels between political issues that happened, 150 years ago and things that happen today. And I was wondering if you could sort of expand a little bit on one of the things you mentioned. You mentioned how slavery in Massachusetts was basically abolished by a single judge's decision. I sort of, that to me sounds like a very small thing, and I'm sort of wondering, how did something like that actually get implemented in practice? Because it seems like, today in 2017, we also have situations where judges' decisions are, wide-reaching and maybe not as, maybe it's not so clear how they're actually implemented. So I was wondering if you could talk about the process of how we went from one judge's decision to everything, slavery actually pretty much gone.
You need to become a historian, and you could go try to do some more work on this, because it's a question that keeps getting asked. And most of us guess, that there just was a kind of anti-slavery feeling that hadn't been articulated. You know, they weren't like, this is before William Lloyd Garrison, so people weren't writing about it and stuff, but there was just a general idea that, you know, we should get rid of this. So when it happens, one of the things that could have happened is that the owner of the slave in the dispute that got to the Supreme Judicial Court could have appealed to the whole court, and he never does.
Right.
Right, so even he, right, decides it's not worth it, right? And so there was that feeling, you know, was just there. Now, if you tried to make a parallel to that, to the Goodman case a few years ago on same-sex marriage in Massachusetts, I think the thing, of course, that goes together here is, of course, that we developed a court that Massachusetts citizens, to use a conservative term, were comfortable with an activist court. They would fight it every once in a while, but they were comfortable that that's an okay thing for judges to say, that they could dig into the Constitution and come up with this idea that's not written directly into the Constitution and make it the law of the Commonwealth.
I guess I'm just sort of thinking of the logistics here. I mean, 5,000 people is still 5,000 different cases where, you know, you basically are turning someone's life upside down. And maybe, you know, it's the will of 90% of the population of Massachusetts, but it seems amazing to me that even in 1790 that we could actually have agreed enough that, you know, we were able to in a short period of time actually cause all of those slaves to become free.
Right, and so we assume that, and we know this in a lot of cases, not all of them, because again, there's lots of gaps in that history, is that, of course, the Africans, right, hearing about this, of course, leave, right? So they cut it. They say, I think I need a salary. I think this means I can get a salary. You have to pay me. And the master says, no. And he said, and he looks up the next day, he's gone. Slave's gone. And there's no one. He can't go he can't get the sheriff to go after him, right? So I think that there was enough activism among the Africans, and then there was this broader than we thought abolitionist feeling in the general population.
I'd like to echo his thanks for coming to speak with us today. I've really enjoyed it. I was wondering if we could hear your thoughts about the splitting of Massachusetts and what is now Maine in the Missouri Compromise.
Well, I think Massachusetts has decided, in the Missouri Compromise, of course, we decided that the only way we could keep the expansion of the United States from becoming the kind of violent conflict that eventually, of course, it did, was that we would just make sure that we always had, every time you invited a free state, that you invited that invited a slave state. And at that time, there was a movement in Maine that they wanted to be independent of Massachusetts because they felt that the people in Massachusetts were simply using Maine to make money, and we did. You know, we spent. If you go through the budget of the state of Massachusetts before what was that? What year was that? 21, 25, right? We sold off huge amounts of forest in Maine. And use that to support the income for Massachusetts. So there were a lot of people up there that were, you know, were looking for something, and this sort of fell into their lap. I don't know if they could have done this without being able to tie it with this national concern, and then getting the support of Congress to do that. Although there was still opposition in Massachusetts to it.
Hi, thanks again for being here. You referenced how in 1790 we were the first of the 13 to have no slaves registered on the census. And I think Massachusetts has long been a very sort of proud, politically blue state. and thinks of ourselves as progressive on many of these issues. But since 1790, there have been a number of incidents. I think about things like busing that have not necessarily reflected that reputation. And I think about how often there might be like star athletes a Boston team is trying to recruit, and you see that they get counseled that Boston won't necessarily be a welcoming place for them. So I'm wondering if you could comment on sort of the trajectory since 1790 and where we stand today, and perhaps what we can do about that seeming reputation.
So I think if you look at that trajectory, as you say, it generally it works out. And generally, I think Massachusetts citizens have a kind of optimism about huge controversies, and I think it goes all the way back. Right? So, of course, before there was the big 19th century controversy in Massachusetts, a human rights controversy in Massachusetts, was not around Africans. It was, of course, around foreigners. And it was around Roman Catholic foreigners, and specifically Irish foreigners. And so lots of and very quickly, many of the ideas that people thought they had settled around civil rights were challenged in very negative ways by the treatment of Roman Catholics. And to the degree that even for a few years in Massachusetts political history, an anti-immigrant party was able to gain control of both houses of our state legislature, the party that became known as the Know Nothings, right? But it all got worked through. That at some point, we've always found compromises to make, or the oppressed minority group got bigger, right?
And again, thank you very much for coming here to speak to us today, and also thank you for your support on the Trans Public Accommodations Law. So actually, my question is about, the 13th Amendment accepts labor as punishment for a crime. So I'm curious your thoughts on prison labor.
Well, let me say about the 13th Amendment. There's a movie out, a document. Have you seen it?
I've been meaning to.
Yeah. So it's called 13 because, and it's interesting that for a lot of people it seems like a reasonable statement, and other people historians argue that it was actually a compromise even then on emancipation, and that was that the last sentence of the 13th Amendment, I don't have it memorized, speaks to the fact that this does not affect people who are in prison. Right? So so the prisoners can't argue, I can't be in prison because you freed the slaves. Right? And that sentence is in the 13th Amendment of the Constitution. So whether it was thought about at that moment, it quickly became a vehicle for especially Southerners, but other Americans, to engage in control of people of African descent by criminalizing a number of deeds, a number of misdemeanors, essentially, or creating all new crimes, where you could quickly arrest people and then keep them in jail in incredibly unjust ways.
And that's still going on to
right.
this day.
And so now so where does that place any kind of labor that we ask prisoners? Should prisoners get paid? Let's see, at the minimum wage when they make license plates, and or furniture, which is done a lot more in Massachusetts than anything else probably in our prisons. And that raises an excellent question about the interpretation of freedom, and also then where do you go forward on that in terms of a reform.
Thank you.
So some of the things you said, the background is I grew up in Massachusetts, and so had history lessons here, and it was interesting to notice which parts of the things you'd said were very familiar to me, like talking about the Missouri Compromise and and things like that. But at the other hand, the context definitely wasn't there. For example, you described the Puritans as invading, which completely fits with what I know now. And even if I think about it, what I knew then, but that was never said, right? They never quite put it in those terms. So that seems like a really important thing going forward, to try to make sure that the kids who are growing up in Massachusetts have that view, like you said, that paradigm, instead of some of the other ones. I have no idea how to affect that, though, or even how to monitor it, right? I'm no longer in school. I don't have kids who I can read their homework and see, oh, that's what they're being taught. Do you have suggestions for how we as a state can try to push education in that direction?
But see, I would turn that question. I really should ask everybody in this room. I mean, so the question is, for you here, how could Google affect that? See, what would you need to do to just raise that up so it sort of becomes viral? See, I do think part of this, there's small things that we can all just do as individuals, and I think part of that is we should be very careful about our vocabulary. We should be careful about what does discover mean, right? So discover means that I saw your car in the parking lot and you had forgot to close the door, right? So I discovered your car, so I mean, how do we talk about this past in words that make sense, that are as accurate as possible? And so invasion, of course, is one of those words that we need to use more often, I think, in talking about these early periods. But I really leave it to you. See, I think that it's the communication piece of this that really it comes to. How do I talk about this? How to get other people to engage in this conversation? So I ask that to all of you.
I'm interested in your thoughts on sort of the role of this highly biased, deeply, gapped, false history that is often taught in the United States, the role in the 2016 elections and the impact on sort of the rise of more publicly espoused racism, the alt-right, and so on, and thoughts about what we as individuals and we collectively as society can do to sort of, push back against this, resurgence of some of these views.
Right. I'll say two things about that, because this is a conversation. I mean, I was just in a meeting to talk about what we should be doing in Massachusetts about health care, considering everything that might be getting ready to happen. And the person started off by saying, anybody tells you that they know what's going to happen doesn't know what they're talking about, right? So we have to put it in that context. But one thing to understand, I think, about this is how different white people are in this country. And I think that is something that everybody in this country needs to think about, but I think white people especially need to think about how little they know about other white people. And so since the election, when I've talked to predominantly black audiences, I say, I understand that we don't know what's going to happen, but generally it does not look good, right? But understand this: you were surprised, all your white neighbors were surprised, but there's one thing that you were not to black people: you were not shocked. See? Half of the white people were shocked. Right? And you are not shocked because you know that there have been worse times. And in your paradigm, in your history, you know that black people have recovered from worse times than these. White people can't remember when they recovered from worse times than these. Right? So I think the two things that we need to do immediately, and I think one of them is that we all need to be talking about white people and learning more about them. Right? And we have to, and part of this is not going to be easy, and that is actually when you learn more about them. There's some good books about that. Every white person needs to take a white studies course. Right? See, how many of you have taken black studies courses? Right? You need to take a white studies course. And then how do we talk to each other? And those are huge questions, and I don't know the answers. See, I'm at the point where I'm trying to formulate the questions, but I don't know the answer. Thank you very much.